All right, listen. We need to start this morning with a story which is somewhat inexplicable. If I'm being honest, I really like just telling Bible stories. Like I think it can be like you can bring them to life that way, and it's not just reading it and all that stuff. But I feel strongly that like some stories are so ridiculous and so just inexplicable. I think that it's helpful just to read it. So we're gonna start this morning by just reading a Bible story. Okay, let's just read this Bible story, then we're gonna talk about it. We're going to old school church here. Here we go. Luke chapter 9. Let's go. As the time drew near for Jesus to ascend to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. He sent messengers ahead to a Samaritan village to prepare for his arrival. But the people of the village did not welcome Jesus because he was on his way to Jerusalem. When James and John saw this, they said to Jesus, "Lord, should we call down fire from heaven to burn them up?" Then Jesus turned and rebuked them, so they went to another village. Somebody over here laughed, and that was the correct response. Right? Like this story is it's odd, right? Like, okay, just on its face, just no details. You don't know anything about anything at all. There's nothing about the life and ministry and everything of Jesus that would make you think that Jesus wants to like napalm a village. For any reason, but much less for a dumb reason like you got to get a hotel somewhere else. That's it. They're just walking on. They're just going. They need a place to crash for the night. They say, "No, thank you. We don't want you to be here." And it just seems like an extreme overreaction to say, "Hey, Jesus, would you like us to kill all the people with fire?" It's weird, too, because it's posed as a question, right? Like, it's definitely posed as a question, which means that James and John kind of expected Jesus to say yes. You know, like, you don't ask a question that you expect a no answer to. You sort of expect. There was at least some expectation that Jesus would say, "Yeah, go for it. Have at it." And that's odd because I don't read anywhere in the Bible where they do that. Like, this is not a normal part of everyday life with Jesus and his disciples, just casually destroying villages of people who offend them. And it's also weird because, like, James and John are important people. Right? Like they have their own name. They have their own stories. Like there's one story in the Bible about James and John where they ask Jesus to get the best seats in the kingdom of heaven, which means they thought themselves to be worthy of the best seats of the kingdom of heaven, which means that at some point they must have done something well, or at least in their minds they did enough good to like get to a place where they could say, maybe we deserve the best seats. And yet they're also doing this. There's an inner circle of Jesus. It's Peter, James, and John. James and John are very, very important people. And this is their response. It's all very strange. But that's just sort of the overarching, like, just looking at it from a bird's eye view of the story. I think when you really start thinking about, what it's like to be in their shoes, I think it gets even more confusing. Here's why. So we know that the Jews and the Samaritans don't like each other. Like we're aware that they've got this rivalry, that they have this beef with each other, right? And we know that, but that problem between the Jews and the Samaritans really boils down to two main issues. The first one is an issue of just nationalism. It's just an issue of their neighbors. They belong to different nations, and they've just had a problem with each other for centuries, as sometimes happens with neighbors, particularly like when we're talking about the Middle East. Like it's very often there's a problem with each other. And this goes back with the Jews and the Samaritans. It goes back like 500-600 years. For centuries and centuries, there is a problem between these two nations. It also was not a problem that was ancient history. There was like a full-fledged war between these nations about 130 years before the birth of Christ. The Jews invaded. And I mean, like a full-on invasion and everything. And so that war had happened. We know during the life of Jesus that there were kind of like we would call them terrorist acts. There were roving bands of people going along and doing things to each other, and bloodshed and violence and threats and everything else. They don't get along because they're not each other. And sometimes that's enough, right? Like there's sometimes enough between nations where it's just you're not me and I'm not you, and we live next to each other, and that's all that it takes. So you would think, okay, well, that would make some degree of sense that that's why the firebomb, calling fire from heaven thing might make a degree of sense. But the problem is, whatever nationalistic issue that the Samaritans had with the Jews and the Jews with the Samaritans, it pales in comparison to the nationalistic issue that was at hand in the first century between the Jews and the Romans. The Romans were literally an occupying nation. They had come in and conquered the people and taken their freedom away from them. The Romans installed their leaders over the Jewish people. The Jews were not a free people like you and I live in a country of free people, because the Romans existed. If you had any sort of issue on a nationalistic level between the Jews and the Samaritans, if that's what was going on, you would have exponentially more of a nationalistic issue between the Jews and the Romans. And in fact, we talk about like the different groups of Jewish people, and there is a group, like one of the main groups of Jewish people are people who we call them zealots. They want to kill all the Romans. But you don't see it from the disciples, right? Like, you don't see James and John going up to some Romans and asking Jesus, hey, can we kill these people? Or going up to, a fort or something and saying, can I firebomb the fort? You don't see that at all. You would think if it's just an issue of like nationalistic difficulty between nations, you'd be far angrier with the people who literally conquered you than the people who just happen to be next door. And yet that's not what we see. Stranger still is the second part of the conflict between Jews and the Samaritans, and that is a religious conflict. They're close. Right? They believe in the same God, but they worship that God differently. They have a different temple. They have a different understanding of the law. They have different books and scriptures, and the scriptures that they have, they read differently. They have a different understanding of what the future is going to hold as far as like when the Messiah comes and what God's plans for the end are. They have a whole different understanding. And so religiously, there is that conflict, and it's sad. And it sounds almost ridiculous when you just say it out loud, like these people that believe in the same God hate each other so much that like they believe in the same God, but they're going to go to war with each other. And yet that has played out throughout history for as long as there's been a history. That people who worship the same God, people who worship maybe a different God, maybe do it a little bit differently, that religion, this thing that is supposed to be positive and hopeful, that brings us together, that gives us peace, that gives us purpose, that is the mechanism that creates conflict. And so again, you might think, well, that does make a degree of sense then, that the Jews and the Samaritans, they have this ideological problem, this religious problem, and so maybe that's why there's the firebombing threat. But then there's the religious leaders of Israel, right? Like the religious leaders of Israel are omnipresent in the ministry of Jesus. And whatever religious beef that the Samaritans and the Jews at large had with each other, the religious leaders of Israel and Jesus's disciples had a much bigger conflict. And the reason is pretty simple. Jesus, we're told in the Bible, in the book of Luke, preaches his first sermon, and the religious leaders tried to throw him off a cliff. That's not a joke. They wanted to pick him up and chuck him off a cliff. That's just what they did. There is a conflict. They argue about everything. They argue about the law. They argue about the Sabbath. They argue about, healings. They argue about authority. They argue about the temple. They argue about like everything. And every time Jesus preaches, there's religious leaders somewhere saying, how dare you? I can't believe you said that. I can't believe you think you can say that. Over and over and over, there is a conflict between the religious leaders of Israel and Jesus, right up until the moment when the religious leaders of Israel partner with the Romans to kill Jesus on a cross. And yet I don't have a Bible verse saying, James and John said, should we call fire down from heaven to destroy the temple? Should I call fire down from heaven to kill these Pharisees, destroy these Sadducees? That's nowhere in the Bible. And so the question has to be asked, what was it about these Samaritans and this act of not being hospitable to Jesus? What was it that made them so angry and just so enraged and infuriated that they would say, hey, Jesus, we'd like to firebomb these people? And they said it with a straight face, expecting Jesus to say, yeah, okay, go for it. It's a good question. And obviously, I don't know the answer completely. I'm not in the minds of James and John 2,000 years ago, but I have a pretty good idea of what it was that made them so angry. And the answer is they were afraid. See, we've been talking the last couple of weeks about this fear thing in the Bible. And what we've talked about is these big picture things. Like, first week we talked about the people of Israel and their fears in Egypt and their fears, in Canaan. And we talked about like slavery and freedom and what should the nation do? And it's just, big picture, what should large groups of people do? And then last week we talked about, being afraid of God and what does it mean to be afraid of God? And how do we look at being afraid of God? And what does it mean to be afraid of people? And what does it mean that God says that, he can destroy us in hell? And what does it mean, all those, those big picture questions. Everything we've talked about has been big picture so far. But the truth of the matter is this. Most of our fears are not big picture. Most people are not kept up at night by what happens to them when they die. Most people are kept up at night by the sort of anxious, insecure, existential dread that we all have. The fact of the matter is this. We're all afraid. We're afraid, for example, that like our lives are completely and utterly meaningless. That's why you live your life the way you live it. You live your life for something that you believe has purpose. And the reason you do that is because you don't want to live your whole life and not have purpose. I've never met a person that just wakes up every day and says, I want to do something that means nothing. I mean, of course, like you go on vacation and, you have hobbies and things like that. But for the most part, we all want to believe that, in the relationships we have, the jobs that we have, the way that we raise our children, all of that what we're doing means something, that we are making the world a better place, that we're doing something. We think often about what our legacy is. We think about have we kind of reached our potential? I've never met somebody that said, I have so much potential to do all sorts of things, but I don't want to do them. Like, I've never met a person who says, I could be great, but I'd rather be mediocre. The reality is what we fear is the day-to-day individual things. We have these insecurities about ourselves and who we are. We have the existential dread and the anxieties, and we live our lives in such a way so that hopefully those things don't come true. It's a universal thing that everybody does, no matter what they believe or what religion or what skin color or what nationality or when they've lived or where they lived. Like, this is just being a human being. We have consciousness. We have an understanding of our own mortality. We know that we have a finite period of time on this planet, and we know that what we want to do, we want to have meaning. And because of everything I just said, that makes the Samaritans a problem for the Jews. Because you see, it's not just that they worship the same God, and it's not just that they have religious differences. It's that they both make the same claims. The Jewish people believed, and still do, that God had chosen them as a people. They were a holy nation, a royal priesthood, right? That they were called out of the world to bless the world, that God has a special relationship with them, and through that special relationship, that God is blessing the entire world. At the core of what a Jewish person is the understanding that they belong to the family of God, that there was a man named Abraham, and there was a man named Isaac, and there was a man named Jacob, and that through that line of people that God is doing something special in the world, and that they are part of that. If you ask a Jewish person, particularly an ancient Jewish person, what makes your life significant, they would say, my relationship with God. I am a chosen person. And the problem is the Samaritans would say exactly the same thing. In fact, Samaritan is a word that outsiders gave to them. In their original languages, in their ancient texts, if you look at what the Samaritans had to say about themselves, they called themselves, and I quote, the children of Israel. The Samaritans said they were God's chosen people. They were the ones that God had called out. They were the ones who were from the line of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They were the ones that God was blessing the whole world with. It was their law, their temple, their promises, their Messiah. That's what they believed. And the problem is you can't have two. At least that's kind of what they thought. The existence of the Samaritans claiming we are the chosen people of God was an affront to the Jewish people who said we are the chosen people of God. When James and John saw Samaritans, they saw a threat. Because James and John were like absolutely convinced they were right. Ish. I love human beings. Human beings are fantastic. We are really great. If you ask people, like, how convinced are you of something? We're always very convinced. We say out loud. We always put up the front that we are exactly convinced that we're right about everything all the time. But if you have a conversation with somebody kind of in quiet, I don't know if you've ever done this, like a real loudmouth, you talk to them like, quietly. Everybody admits that, like, well, maybe. The bravado that we have trying to convince everybody else that we're right is covering up an insecurity that we have that says, yeah, but I might be wrong. James and John were convinced they were right, but they also knew quietly in their heart of hearts, we might be wrong. That fear, that anxiety, it's there all the time. And so here's a story where Jesus comes along and he goes to a Samaritan village and he says, hey, we want to stay here. That's an act of grace and love and acceptance. This is Jesus saying, I accept you, Samaritans. And the Samaritans spit it back in his face. And they tell him where he can stick it. And that fear and that anxiety, that thing in the heart of hearts that made them say, well, maybe they're right and we're wrong. I mean, like, we've just got information from people that told us stuff. The same way they got their information from people who told them stuff. It became rage. You see, the problem with all of this is that it's not the big things that keep us up at night, and it's not the big things that make us lash out. It's the stuff that we have in here that makes us lash out. The anger you feel at the audacity that somebody else is like that. That's something that's in here. And the other guys got it too. The other ladies got it too. Like, we've all got it. We all have this fear and this anxiety and this insecurity. And we were all tempted to be like James and John and say, well, should I firebomb somebody? That'd make me feel better. They'd be gone. And so there's an antidote to this. And the antidote to this is a thing that we read in, from of all people, John. He looks back on his life decades, like 50 years after this. John is writing about all of this thing. And John is talking about, how we approach the world and how we approach people and how we approach God. And he writes this in 1 John chapter 4. He says this. He says, love has no fear, because perfect love expels all fear. If we are afraid, it is for fear of punishment. And this shows that we have not fully experienced God's perfect love. We love each other because he loved us first. The antidote to the fear, to the anxiety becoming rage, the antidote to all of that is love. It's treating people the way you'd like to be treated. Jesus identifies that that's what love means, that love is treating people the way we'd like to be treated. The antidote is to see in somebody else that they are also afraid, to see in somebody else that they also have issues, to see in somebody else that they also have problems, and to recognize, hey, the person that I think is my enemy is actually just me in a mirror. And so the antidote is not to lash out in fear, but it's to look out in love and to say, okay, this person, I should love that person the same way I love myself. Boy, is that easy to say. And boy, is that hard to do. But I think we can understand the principle a little bit better when we see it not just laid out in words, but we see it in a story. So let's tell a story. One day, Jesus was in the temple, and he was teaching, and he was preaching, and he was doing the stuff that Jesus does. And his sermon was rudely interrupted by kind of a clamor, like a kind of a, I don't know why I said clamor, it's not a Christmas song. Commotion, that's the word I was looking for, like a commotion of people, right? And they kind of stop, and you kind of like a crowd is out talking, and they come closer, and what you see is a group of religious leaders, and they've got a woman with them, and they bring this woman to where Jesus was teaching. If you can imagine seeing, there's the religious leaders, then there's this woman, there's this crowd of people that have been listening to Jesus, there's his disciples, and there's Jesus, and it's kind of this whole group of people. And Jesus had been teaching, but the sermon's over now because the religious leaders have something to say. And they bring this woman, and they put her in front of everybody. And they look at Jesus and say, hey, Jesus, hey, Rabbi, hey, teacher, we got a question for you. And they said, look, we caught this woman in the act of adultery. Like, in the act, we caught her. Like, we dragged this lady out of bed. And the law of Moses says that we should stone her to death for her sin. What do you tell us? Now, the story in the Bible tells us directly that this is just a trap. They're not actually curious about what Jesus has to say. But it's actually a pretty good trap when you think about it, because what Jesus, as this rabbi, as this teacher, this rival to the religious leaders, what Jesus, they think they've backed him into a corner, and he has to say something. He doesn't really have a good answer. If he says, yeah, the law of Moses says go ahead and kill her, well, that's not good. And also, for whatever it's worth, the whole thing of Jesus' ministry is that he's different. Like, he's an alternative. Jesus, in everything he's doing, everything he's teaching, he's showing the people a different way of looking at God than the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the priests and everybody else is saying. And so if he just says, yeah, do what they say, he loses everything about what he's teaching. And, that's also, he's killing a woman. So that's not good either. If, on the other hand, he says, well, that's crazy. What are you guys doing? Do you have nothing better to do this morning? Like, why are you just wandering around people's houses trying to find adulteresses? Like, what are you doing? If he says that, if he says, like, let's show mercy and grace and all that to her, well, then Jesus is directly arguing with the law of Moses, which is kind of a big deal to the people of Israel. Like, he's arguing against this whole system of religion and law and order and he's arguing against all of that. No matter what he says, then, he's going to anger a good chunk of people. And whoever he angers here is not even the point. Whatever he says, these religious leaders will now have ammunition forever. They can tell everybody, yeah, fine, Jesus did that miracle. But do you remember that story of the lady caught in adultery? Yeah, fine, he's arguing with us about the Sabbath. But man, remember what he said about the law? They've got it's a trap that no matter what happens, they can use his words against him. They're playing politics. It's gotcha. And so they think they've got Jesus. And so Jesus just decides to completely and utterly ignore them. It's a choice. As the story tells us, Jesus kind of just bends down and starts writing stuff in the dirt, playing in the dirt. I love the theologians, like, the Bible doesn't tell us what Jesus is doing at all. And the theologians are like, I wonder what he's doing. Let's make stuff up. There's all sorts of people that have made up different things about what Jesus was doing. I don't know what he was doing. He was definitely just playing in the dirt. The funny thing, though, as he plays in the dirt, is the people who are there interpret this as being offensive. Because they interpret this as Jesus just disregarding them and ignoring them and not giving them the time of day, which is basically what Jesus was doing. He was ignoring them and not giving them the time of day. They interpret this as offensive because Jesus wanted them to be offended. Like, I'm going to show you how little this conversation how little importance this is. You guys are completely off. I'm just going to draw in the dirt. And so they kind of press him. They say, man, you haven't answered us. What are we going to do? And Jesus, tells them, fine. All right, let's kill her. And we'll stone her to death. We'll do it right here, right now. It'll be a good time for everybody. And here's how we'll do it. The person who has never sinned will throw the first rock, and then everybody will follow. I just need one guy who's never sinned to throw a rock at her. And then we'll go. And Jesus resumes, drawing in the dirt. Because again, he thinks the whole thing is stupid. Of course, the problem now is anybody who wants to start the proceedings is going to confess that they don't have sin. And that, of course, is a sin because they're publicly lying and everybody sins the whole thing. So eventually, one by one, everybody leaves and Jesus is left with just the woman. And then this is the nice part of the story. She's had a rough day. And Jesus, he comforts her. He points out that hey, nobody's gonna do anything. Everything's fine. You're gonna be okay. And then he encourages her, hey, you realize that you could be better than this. You could stop sinning. You quit doing this, and then look, just everything's fine. You're great. Go do it again. Go try better. Go try your life a little better this time. And that's kind of the end of the story. Okay. Here's what I love about that story. Half of you guys checked out as soon as I started with it. So come back. There's certain Bible stories that are like that. You just know them super well, and you've heard me and other people talk about them all the time, and it just becomes white noise. I like to call them the name that tune stories. You remember that show? I can name that tune in 4 notes. Some of y'all can name the Bible story of the woman caught in adultery in 1 note. Jesus is at the temple one day. Woman caught in adultery. It's just what it we all know this story really well. Okay, cool. If you're looking for new insights, I don't have them. I'm just a guy talking about this 2,000 years later. Go read a book. Okay. What's interesting about this story that I don't think we think about is the perspective of each person and how every single person in this story, other than Jesus, is entirely driven by fear. Entirely. Now, look, the Bible tells us that this is a test for Jesus from the religious leaders. The religious leaders are terrified of Jesus. We know this because the Bible tells us over and over they're terrified of Jesus. They're scared of losing their own authority. They're scared that he's going to replace them. They're scared that he's going to start a war with Rome. They're scared that the people will follow him and they'll follow him off a cliff. They're scared of basically everything Jesus does. The entire impetus for this entire story is their fear of Jesus, that they are acting out a way to defeat him. So that way their fears go away. The religious leaders bring this woman because they're afraid of everything Jesus is and everything he represents, and this woman is essentially a pawn on the chessboard that they think they can get checkmate with. Okay. The Bible doesn't tell us that the woman is afraid, though. Does it need to? Look, I'm going to assume a couple things. I'm going to assume when they say they caught her in the act, what they didn't mean literally that. I'm going to assume that this is a woman who spent the night with a fella. It's not her husband. They found out about it. They're hey, we can go get this woman. So what I'm imagining is that she wakes up in the morning and somebody is coming through the front door, and they grab her out of the bed and they take her to the temple. That's the beginning of the movie Taken. This is, and she doesn't know if Liam Neeson is here or has a special set of skills. For all she knows, she's being taken to her death here, right? You're groggy in the morning, you're barely awake, and this is what this is terrifying. And also, there's no evidence she knows Jesus. So the second they say, hey, the law says to kill her, she's probably thinking, what? This guy is now judge, jury, and executioner? This guy I've never seen before? Obviously, this is a terrifying situation. It's also a terrifying situation, not just because she could physically die, but it's a terrifying situation because she got caught. Remember that, like, I don't want to reference modern things, but there was I hate making references that become dated. Like, I want somebody a year from now to be able to listen to this sermon on YouTube and be like, oh, cool. He's not referencing, something that happened that week. But we all know what happened a couple weeks ago at a Coldplay concert, right? Nobody who is cheating wants to be found out. Because there's a social cost to being found out. It's not like they didn't die, but there was a social cost to being found out. For her, for him, for the wife, for everybody. There's a social cost when this situation is found out. So this woman, she's not, even if she's not going to assume she's going to die for this, but she can also rightly assume that she's going to be ostracized, that she's going to be isolated, that she's going to lose friends, she's going to lose family, she's going to lose people. That her life now is going to become, divvied up into before and after the event. It's terrifying. And the reason for that is because the crowd of people who listen to Jesus were also terrified. Look, the church gets a bad rap sometimes for things, and sometimes the church gets a rap that people don't understand. One of the things you'll see, not just in our religion, but in every religion, is that religious people seem to be somewhat obsessed with sex. And it's interesting because when you look at the Bible, it's not like sex is this major topic. Okay, fine, Song of Solomon exists. It's weird. You don't need to read it. But for the most part, you read Leviticus, and there's some rules about sex, but there's a whole lot more about, like, goats, Like, it's weird. It's a weird thing that we focus and fixate on sex, right? Of all the sins. You hear so much more from people about sex than, like, gambling. I don't want to meddle, but there's some sins that are out there that hurt people that we rarely talk about. So why sex? Well, the answer is really simple. Adultery hurts a lot of people. It blows up a marriage. It hurts children. It destroys a family. And what is society if not a collection of families? You start attacking the family unit, whatever it is, however we do it. You start attacking the family unit, that's an attack on civilization itself. And whether we'd ever articulate it or not, that's why we're upset. We're upset not because of what it means to you, the person committing adultery, but what it means to the rest of us out here. What does it mean in a society when it's not a loving family unit of faithful, loyal people who have committed to being with each other forever? But what does it mean when it's chaos? And so in our fear, we lash out and we obsess. The people who were in the crowd would have hated this woman far more than, say, like a Roman soldier. Because you kind of expect the Roman soldier to be violent and bloody. You don't expect the wife to do this. And so in their fear, they also looked at this situation and were interested in what Jesus is going to say. Everybody in the story is afraid. And Jesus diffuses the situation by showing love to everybody. And look, I'm not saying this is easy. I'm not saying that you respond. I'm not saying that, you're just going to go home and be like, well, okay, I'm not insecure anymore. Let's just love everybody. Man, this is a great sermon if y'all can do that. Man, get me a trophy or something. See, now I'm afraid of how big the trophy will be. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is I don't think it's even a matter of how. I really don't. I think it's a matter of what. I think what John is trying to get us to understand is that everybody's afraid. Everybody. Young, old, in the middle, male, female, black, white, from our country, from another one, in our religion, in another one. Everybody's afraid. Everybody's got insecurity. Everybody's got, and everybody's got this existential crisis of what am I? Who am I? Where am I going? Does my life have meaning? Does anybody care? If I keel over tomorrow, Is this just going to be a thing where I keel over tomorrow and then there's a funeral and some people come and pretend they liked me and then nobody thinks about me for 3 months after that? Like after 3 months, we're just done? Like, we all have that. And the solution to that is the recognition that just as this is a universal thing and problem that we all have those fears and insecurities, that the universal need for love is also just as strong. Because everybody has fears, that is why everyone needs love. Because we are all afraid, and whether these fears are legitimate or not, because everybody lives with anxiety and everybody lives with insecurity and everybody lives with these fears, that is why everybody is desperately in need of and absolutely deserving of love. And I don't know how you're going to get there. Like with your Aunt Martha, whose boy does she not deserve it at all, it doesn't seem to you. I don't know how you're going to get there with people who vote differently than you. I have no idea what you're supposed to do. I have no idea how you're going to get there with people who fundamentally, see the world in a different way than you. I don't know how you're going to get there with your husband and wife. I don't know how you're going to get there when you're the one who's made the terrible mistake. What I know is we have got to start in a place where we say, look, everybody is afraid. Everybody has this existential thing. And therefore, everybody has a need for love. And we've got story after story. We've got example after example. We've got template after template. But God has given us a life to live. And we got to figure it out on our own. But we'll never figure it out if we won't be people who understand that when you see somebody different than you, that's a person that's got the same stuff going on in here that you do. And the reason they're doing the stuff they're doing that you disapprove of is that they got the same stuff in here and they're just responding a little different. And so instead of condemnation, instead of throwing a stone, literally or figuratively, instead of calling down fire from heaven, literally or figuratively. By the way, can they even do that? Did Jesus be like, oh, also, I'm going to give you this thing, I'm going to give you this ability to perform a miracle, you can call down fire from heaven. Should we use that? Never, but I'm going to give you the chance. That part of the story always kind of, anyway. We're all afraid, and so we all need love. And this is our third week of our series called Don't Be Afraid, ? As we've talked about fear, we've talked about all this stuff. We got one more week next week. But in the meantime, this is our lesson for this morning. Our third lesson from a series called Don't Be Afraid. Every person has fears, and so every person needs love, and this includes you. Every person has fears, and so every person needs love. This includes you. We're going to sing a song. We offer an invitation. The Bible teaches that we should repent and be baptized. You've never done that. Let's do it. If you want to join the church, let's talk about that. That's cool. And in the meantime, we're just going to sing a song. And I feel like there's something else I usually say here, but I forgot. So let's sing a song. Yeah, we're done.